Welcome, everybody, and good Shabbos. For this week and the following weeks to come, we're going to talk about the renewal of the covenant between God and humanity. Not just the Jews themselves, even though it may have started with the Jews, but Mar Yeshua's message and the renewed covenant that he advocated was not just for one group of people, but for all of humanity, to create a new humanity with qualities such as pure love, pure consciousness, compassion, empathy, etc. So, what we're going to be discussing over the next several weeks is the renewal of the covenant. Did Jesus create Christianity? Did his apostles, his direct apostles, did they create Christianity? The answer is no. Paul created Christianity. Jesus was not trying to make a clear break away from Judaism. It was with St. Paul in the letters or the epistles of Paul where there was a delineation where Paul began to say that the law no longer needs to be followed. The law meaning the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. And he said that all you need is the risen Jesus, just to believe and you're saved. You don't need to do anything. You just need to believe and you're cool with God. So I beg to differ with that before even jumping into Jesus's phrases. If we just say, I believe in something, but we don't act the part, if we don't live the message, then I don't think we're going to advance spiritually, no matter how you perceive that progression to be, that evolution to be. Whether you see it as evolution in this life or in some other life beyond this, if we're not behaving ourselves, if we're not living the message, then we're not growing. Belief is not enough. As James said in his epistle, faith without works is dead. So faith alone is not enough. We have to do something with that faith. So my thesis for this week and the following few weeks is that Jesus and his immediate disciples did not create Christianity, as will be shown through the canonical Gospels and non-canonical Gospels. We'll show that Jesus was trying to renew, to reform, to evolve the Judaic system. So Jesus did not try to replace Judaism. He wanted to radically reform it. So here's the first evidence of that, found in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, this is from Matthew chapter 5. Very direct, very much in opposition to a lot of the Christology that Paul developed in his epistles, because Paul very clearly in many of his letters said we could toss out the law, the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. All we need to do is believe in the resurrection of Jesus and we're good to go. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus or anything like that. I'm just saying that Jesus did not throw away Judaism. Jesus was an observant Jew. He was a Rav, a Jewish master that taught from the Torah and other sources that were developing at his time, which is now called the intertestamental literature and the pseudepigrapha. So again, here it's very clear. Jesus is very clear and in very clear opposition to what Paul teaches, to Paul's developing Christology, to Paul's developing religion, which is called Christianity. Jesus is saying something much different if you read Matthew and if you read Paul's epistles. Again, it says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill the heart of that message, to renew that message. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same," which is what Paul did, "will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven, the least in the rulership of heaven, the least in the sovereignty of God. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called the greatest in the Malkuth. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You'll never have the Malkuth born in your heart. You'll never experience expansion of God consciousness within your soul." That is what he's teaching. So Jesus is not saying, let's get rid of Judaism and I'm here to teach something new. He's saying, let's do this and let's do this the right way. What he criticized was man-made laws and man-made interpretations of the Torah. And he also didn't like the fact that Torah was taught to specific people, which would exclude the common people, the Amaharetz. It would exclude women in general, and it would have also excluded anybody that they saw as impure or a sinner. Well, then what's the Torah for? What was the meaning of Mar Yeshua's life or any spiritual teacher's life if they're not there to help people that don't know what they're doing, right? People that are lost somewhere in the process, like myself. We rely on spiritual masters that are truly one with God in spirit to teach us and to guide us. And such a master was Mar Yeshua. So he also, although Mar Yeshua was very big on preserving Torah, not abolishing the law, and the law means the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, he wanted to see a more humane, compassionate exposition and application of the law. He wanted to see people doing this in such a way that it lifted them up rather than bogged them down. So to that extent, Paul did have a point that would have agreed with the historical Jesus's teachings. It's the heart of Torah that matters. What is the heart of the Torah? We'll talk about that as the weeks go on. Today is just an introduction. But the most important thing to take away from here is that Jesus did not come to establish a new religion. He came to renew the covenant that God had with the Jewish people, and by extension with all of humanity that would want to follow such teachings. Again, in Matthew chapter 9, we find something about this radical transformation that Jesus took Judaism through, that he wanted to lead people to this new interpretation of the law, of the Torah, of the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, which Christians often call the Old Testament. I prefer to call the Old Testament the Hebrew Testament or the Hebrew Bible, because it's not something that's old. There's a reason why the Christians call it the Old Testament and the Gospels the New Testament, because Paul wanted to replace Judaism with this new message. And then those that wrote the Gospels after Paul's time flew with it, and they wanted to insinuate that the Hebrew Testament is old. It's no longer truly applicable. It's replaced by Jesus's death and resurrection, which is salvatory to most Christians. So it's old, outdated, obsolete. That is the message of the Old Testament. The reason why Christians kept the so-called Old Testament is because they wanted something old. Christianity at one time was brand new. What was its basis? What was its proof? Well, its proof was the Old Testament, that Christianity grew out of, or was the evolution, the replacement for the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Testament, whatever you want to call it. That's the history. It's a very old history, and we're grounded in that history, but we don't accept that history. Jesus is now the fulfillment of that. And they picked many phrases and cherry picked many phrases out of Isaiah and different parts of the Old Testament as proof sayings that Jesus was God, that Jesus was the Messiah born, the only Son of God, that he would suffer and die. They cherry picked these phrases, which is not what those phrases were originally intended to mean. But anyhow, here's what Jesus says about his new interpretation of Judaism, this renewal of the covenant, of the law, fulfillment of the law. Matthew chapter 9, verses 16 and 17. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak, for the patch pulls away from the cloak, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. Otherwise, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved. Right? So here, the idea of a bursting wineskin that can't hold new wine. The new wine is Jesus's Holika, his interpretation, his teachings, his evolutionary view and revolutionary view of Judaism and how it could be used to free or liberate souls from self-imposed debt to God, to humanity, to the earth. The way that Jesus saw the Sadducees and the Pharisees interpreting and applying the law with man-made interpretations and also the addition of man-made laws interwoven in there, he saw it as a hole in a cloak, damaged goods. Not something you should throw away, but something that you should patch up. And he's telling you how to do that. So if you put a patch on clothing, not many people do this nowadays. Most people throw away their clothes and buy new ones when there's a hole. But in the olden days, such as when I was a kid, if you had a hole in your jeans, then grandma would come along and she'd put a patch over those jeans. But what you have to understand is that that patch has to be stretched out. It has to be worked. It has to be used before you sew it onto the hole and then mend that hole. So here, to me, the implied message is that the hole in the cloak is a rift that was being created in Judaism. The lack of application, the lack of fulfillment that it should have in people's lives. Because the blind were leading the blind, Jesus said. They weren't even taking themselves to heaven, and they were taking everybody else away from heavenly consciousness too, was Jesus's criticism of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So there was a hole created in Judaism, a lack of effectiveness due to the way that the spiritual elite were not properly teaching people. And they were also non-inclusive. They were exclusive. Only certain people really went to the temple to worship, the temples, first temple and the second temple, before it was destroyed in 70 AD. But women, outcasts, people of the land were not commonly involved in such rituals. It was only special people that could go. And Jesus wanted to include everybody. He wanted to mend this rift between God and people. So what did Jesus do? He went and he sat with people that drank alcohol. He taught prostitutes. He hung out with women that had multiple husbands, the Samaritan woman at the well. He hung out with women in general. And many women became his best disciples, including Mary Magdalene, which was his superior, top-notch disciple, far above the men. He hung out with sinners purposely because what else would be his goal? A spiritual master does not incarnate on earth to hang out with pure people. He or she comes here to help people that need help with their purificatory process. But if you put a fresh patch that's not stretched out on a hole, it's just going to tear again. And that's kind of the message, is that Jesus saw that people weren't accepting his message back then. Not immediately, at least. Of course, Christianity has taken over the world in many ways. Vast populations, billions of people practice it on this earth with some understanding of some way about how it should be interpreted and how it should be applied in their lives. But Jesus was just saying that, his teachings weren't being taken seriously by many people, at least by the hierarchy, the temple establishment. And his teachings were like a new patch put on the hole and it was tearing apart. And Christians might not want to hear that, but it was true. I mean, he was chased to the streets. They tried to catch him and kill him many times before the crucifixion actually happened. He was running in and hiding and staying in safe houses throughout Galilee and Jerusalem area. So a lot of the temple establishment did not like him. They did not like that he was teaching something different from what they were used to and what people were used to. That he was including the untouchables, so to speak, the unteachables. He was doing a lot of things against the grain that got him into trouble. And Jesus did not have to be enlightened or God or anything else to know that they were trying to track him down to kill him. When you go against society's rules, what they accept, there's going to be some pushback. And back in those days, the pushback was execution. So Jesus was very aware that he was going to die. He knew from a very early age that this was going to happen. And from the very beginning, his mother was crying outside. He's teaching inside a house, and they say, your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside, Lord. And he said, who is my mother and who is my brother? And Mary, the mother of Jesus, was actually insinuating in Mark that he was crazy. She was trying to give him an excuse, because if the temple establishment heard him teaching something different than them, then the Romans would want to kill them. And further, the Judaic higher establishment, the temple establishment, would want to kill him for teaching something different than they taught religiously. But in addition to that, if Roman soldiers or Roman spies heard him teaching a messianic message, that was considered a threat to their imperial emperor run government, because many messianic interpretations were of a divine Messiah ben David descending and killing all the oppressors, and a new king would come and establish Jewish rule across the world. So Romans didn't like any kind of messianic teaching at all, even though Jesus didn't teach the Messiah ben David, as we've talked about. Still, that was in the mix of rumors around that time. And any kind of rumor about a messianic king coming to rule and overthrow the Roman Empire was a quick way of getting killed. And many people were killed that claimed to be the Messiah in those days. So Jesus wasn't the only one proclaimed to be the Messiah, or even the Davidic Messiah. There were others that came about, made the claim, and were defeated. So, and you can't put new wine into an old wineskin. It just bursts. It doesn't work. So Jesus saw that whenever he tried to put his new wine, his new teachings into the Jewish atmosphere of his time, that it was causing a lot of problems. Families were fighting against families. Neighbors were fighting against neighbors, because as his message spread, a young person that would be inspired by Jesus would go home and tell his mom. And mom would say, no, you can't believe that. We believed this all of our life. Right? And then the young person might be very dedicated to Jesus and decide to follow him, and that would create rifts in the family. And those rifts in the family are also the torn patches from a hole, the burst wineskins. So as Jesus taught, there were lots of religious struggles. There were governmental problems with the Romans. And often in the families would be fighting amongst themselves because there'd be new beliefs coming into a very traditional society. And that still happens today in our world. So Jesus was preaching a new radical message, and this was causing some problems, right? This was causing problems for Jesus, and it was also causing problems for the Judaic temple establishment. And for families that were the good Jewish families of the day that followed the rules and listened to those Pharisees and listened to the Sadducees, And when something new came in, it caused rifts, broken patches, broken wineskins. So this was a very radical reinterpretation of Judaism that made people think. And even though today most people, when they just read Jesus's teachings, they think, yeah, that's nice, that makes sense, that's compassionate. But that's just not how it was done. It's just not how it was done back then. And this is what Jesus wanted to see. And when Jesus said it's the heart that matters more than the letter of the law, which is what he said, the heart of the Torah, the feeling of the Torah is more important than man-made interpretations of the Torah. Well, then everybody lost their mind, right? Because then this was essentially telling people you don't need to listen to your Pharisee, their rulings, because it's the heart that matters, not what they tell you to do. And you can imagine what that did. What it ultimately caused was Christ's crucifixion on the cross, which was not the Jews. The Jews did not kill Jesus. Jesus was a Jew. He didn't commit suicide. The people that killed Jesus was the temple establishment and the Roman governor. The Roman governance would be more accurate. So last verse of the day from the Gospel of Thomas, Logian 47, B through C. No one seems to prefer new wine over old wine. This was Jesus's frustration, as it is for most groundbreaking spiritual figures throughout all time. There's a lot of pushback whenever something that is accepted for long periods of time, thousands of years, and somebody steps up and says, hey, this is good, but can't we do this in addition to or instead of? And then often people don't like change or criticism or feedback. So Jesus's feedback did end up in resulting in the ending of his life. But ultimately, the message, the most important parts of his message did reach the world. They are preserved. But you have to learn how to see what is fact from what is non-fact, what is possible from what is probable. This is what we teach in this online church. It's very important. For example, it's very likely that Jesus had these frustrations that we're talking about because it's just common sense. Just look at any innovator in the world, whether it's political, religious, or in your own home, trying to change the way that, trying to change the chores in the house. When you sit down at a house meeting and you talk about who does the dishes and how we should arrange that schedule so that different people can do the dishes, you're going to have a little bit of discomfort, right? Nobody likes change. Nobody likes to change the pattern they're used to. And when some people are very wise and they hear a great teacher or a great idea and they take to it because they realize that nothing is permanent, right? There is no truth for all time that does not evolve. There is absolute truth, which is pure consciousness, which is beyond all religion. But how truth is interpreted and presented by a spiritual master to his or her disciples, that does change as time moves on, as science teaches us stuff, as we learn more about quantum physics, and as culture and society changes. What is acceptable today in society was banned or even taboo 30, 50 years ago. So things change. So how we interpret and talk about truth, how we apply truth must evolve with time. And if it doesn't evolve with time, then it's going to die. It's going to become a dead, unused religion. And honestly, Jesus was reforming Judaism so it wouldn't die. Or at least that was his perspective, whether true or not, whether we accept it or not. He was reforming so that something would evolve with the times, grow and become more applicable to what's happening in his day and today. And Christians today need to continue that evolution. Otherwise, Christianity will die. Look at the pews in these huge Catholic churches. They're all empty. All you see is white-haired people. Pretty soon, the priests are going to be talking to graveyards, right? The ministers are going to be preaching in graveyards. It's not that we have to change Christ's teaching, but we have to apply it in modern day sensibilities. We have to look for the likely historical verses and apply them. We have to get rid of mythology and legend, or at least teach people that this is mythology, this is legend, and these are the historical teachings. People should know the difference. Legend is amazing. Myth is an amazing teaching tool, but we have to know whether it historically happened or whether it's meant to be a teaching, whether it's meant to be an archetype to help our souls to evolve. But that's for a different day. Last verse is kind of a resaying of Matthew, but in a beautiful and very direct way. So again, Gospel of Thomas, Logan 47b through c. No man drinks old wine and immediately desires to drink new wine. New wine is not to be put into old wineskins, lest they burst, nor is old wine put into a new wineskin, lest it spoil it. An old patch is not sewn onto a new garment, because it will split apart. So really, it's the first sentence that we need to talk about, because we've already sufficiently established the second two sentences of this verse from Matthew in our discussion on that. No man drinks old wine and immediately desires to drink new wine. So what is he saying here is old wine is the Judaism interpreted by the Pharisees and Sadducees of his day. The new wine is the radical reinterpretation of Judaism, the renewal of the covenant that Jesus was seeking to give to his people and to the world, to all of humanity, the new humanity. So people that are used to old wine, used to the way that things are, used to the religion that their great-grandparents and grandparents taught them and they were just expected to believe because they were born into that family, right? The old wine, you're used to it. But whenever new wine comes along, Jesus's new covenant, his teachings, people are often hesitant to try new wine when they're used to the same old thing. If you're used to eating fried chicken every night, you're not likely to want to try raw octopus sushi, right? That's very new and very radical to eat sushi if you're used to eating fried chicken every night and mashed potatoes, right? If you're used to that, you're not likely to branch out and try something new. And this was what Jesus was lamenting, is that a lot of the Jews of his time, good people, were used to the old wine and they rejected the new wine simply because it was new, because it was a fresh look at something, a new interpretation, a new application. And many times in life, at work, at religion, in politics, the same old stuff is done, even though it doesn't even work, which is what Jesus was criticizing about the Pharisaical teaching of Judaism, that it didn't work, that it didn't save them, and it didn't save the people they were teaching. It didn't liberate them. It didn't purify them or sanctify them enough, or not at all. This is what he said throughout the Gospels. Just read it. So here he's lamenting that people want to stick to the same old, even if it's not working, in favor of something new. That's what this is saying. So again, Jesus' renewal of the covenant, although it ultimately did, in one way or another, spread across the whole world, with one lens put on it, or some horse blinders put on it, it did spread. But in his times, he really had to fight. And he actually gave up his life. He sacrificed himself. He knew that he would be killed one way or the other by pushing this message of compassion and pure love. Because when you go against the grain, expect a fight. He taught as long as he could before he had to give up the body, But before he gave up the body, he adequately prepared his apostles to go in different directions and teach the message. And his message, in some shape or form, still to this day, is one of the greatest molding factors for better and for worse of all of humanity. So, conclusions about the renewal of the covenant of God with humanity. Yes, Jesus' message was beautiful, but in his day it was not accepted by most. There was a lot of pushback. In early Christianity, there was a lot of oppression of the early Christians, a lot of persecution against the early Christians, a lot of execution of early Christians because they were teaching something different. They were persecuted by early Jews, and they were heavily persecuted by the Romans. The Roman society, whenever Christianity was starting to flourish, they viewed them as atheists, which may seem weird because Christians preach about God the Father, and very early on, Jesus was interpreted as being God. At least within a couple of centuries, he was interpreted as that. So why were they considered atheists? Because they would not worship the pantheon of Roman gods in the temples, and they wouldn't worship the emperor who was viewed as a manifestation of God or gods himself. So for those who accepted Mar Yeshua's radical evolutionary view of the renewed or fulfilled covenant, they were offered the baptism of John and were told three major points. If you want to start following this teaching, this renewed Holika, which is all about purifying the heart, purifying one's consciousness, then number one, you should realize the rulership of God is near to you. The Malkuth of God is near to you. And if you want, by doing these teachings, you can invite that Malkuth, the sovereignty, the rulership of God, into your heart. Two, lovingly submit to the Father, to Abba. Father, Mother, God, Yahweh, God, whatever you want to call it. Jesus personalized it as Abba, which means Father, Mother. And number three, you had to do the proclamation. You had to do the proclamation. You had to actually do the teachings. It wasn't about just believing in somebody, but Jesus is a spiritual master that realized this is what needed to happen in order to renew the covenant. And I'm telling you, this is what you do. This is what you shouldn't do. And if you do it, then you're going to establish God's rulership in your heart, the Malkuth in your heart. And when you lovingly submit to God, then everything seems to flow better in life. I wish everybody a very good Shabbos, and we'll continue our conversation next Friday. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you next time.